Sometimes the greatest treasures hide behind the most humble facades. When Astrid lost her husband to the winter seas 2 years past, she thought her days of taking risks had ended forever. Standing before the crumbling longhouse as morning mist rolled across the fjord, her weathered hands clutched a single silver coin, her last piece of currency. The hall's broken timbers and sagging roof spoke of decades of neglect, moss creeping through gaps where proud warriors once feasted. Villagers shook their heads as she approached the merchant, muttering about foolish widows and worthless purchases. But Astrid saw beyond the decay. She saw shelter for her grown son Erik, potential for their dwindling fortunes, and perhaps something more, a whisper of destiny her grandmother might have recognized. As the silver coin exchanged hands, Erik watched with embarrassment and concern. The purchase seemed desperate, the act of a woman who had lost everything. What neither of them knew was that this crumbling hall held secrets worth more than a king's ransom. Before we continue with Astrid's story, tell us where you're watching from. And if this tale of hidden treasures resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of salt and dying leaves as Astrid walked the perimeter of her new property, her boots crunching through frost-brittle grass. The longhouse loomed before her like the skeleton of some great beast, its once proud beams now grey and weathered. Erik followed at a distance, his jaw set in the stubborn line she remembered from his father. "Mother, this is madness," he said, not for the first time that morning. At 28, Erik possessed his father's broad shoulders and steady hands, but none of Ragnar's gift for seeing opportunity in chaos. "We could have bought grain for the winter with that silver, food to last until spring planting." Astrid ran her palm along one of the main support posts, feeling the solid oak beneath layers of neglect. The wood was sound, scarred and darkened by age, but strong. Like herself, she thought with grim humor. "Your father always said the best investments were the ones others were too blind to see." "Father also said many things before the sea took him," Erik replied, his voice gentler now, "including that we should be practical, careful." She turned to study her son's face, seeing Ragnar in the set of his jaw, but recognizing her own stubbornness in his eyes. Erik had inherited the worst of both their natures, her pride and his father's caution, a combination that left him perpetually torn between action and hesitation. The village of Kjarvik stretched below them, a cluster of timber and thatch houses hugging the shoreline where fishing boats bobbed at anchor. Smoke rose from morning fires, and she could see the familiar figures going about their daily routines. Olaf the shipbuilder mending nets by his workshop, Sigrid hanging laundry despite the threatening clouds, Leif practicing sword forms in his family's yard, the wooden blade cutting precise arcs through the air. Once, Astrid had been part of that rhythm. She'd had her place in the community's careful dance of survival. Ragnar's wife, Erik's mother, a woman of standing whose opinion carried weight in village matters. Now she felt like a stranger watching from the hillside, disconnected from the life she'd once helped shape. "The Eriksons are sailing for Iceland in the spring," Erik said, breaking into her thoughts. "Gunnar offered me a place on his crew. Good wages and a chance to see new lands. You want to leave?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "I want to provide for my family," Erik replied. "For you? This haul won't put food in our bellies or silver in our purse. But a season's trading voyage could set us up properly." Astrid understood the logic, even admired the young man's sense of responsibility. But the thought of Erik sailing away, perhaps never to return, like so many who sought their fortunes across the Whale Road, filled her with a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. She'd grown up in this valley, daughter of Thorvald the Wise, who'd served as the village law speaker for 3 decades. Her childhood had been filled with stories of ancient kings and forgotten treasures, of halls where warriors feasted and skalds sang of heroes whose names would echo through the ages. Her grandmother, Ragnhild, had possessed the site or claimed to, and often spoke of signs and portents, of the way fate wove itself through the choices of mortals. "Your grandmother would have understood," Astrid murmured, more to herself than to Erik. Grandmother saw omens in cloud shapes and bird flights, Erik said, but his tone held affection despite the skepticism. She also insisted the old gods still walked among us, disguised as beggars and wanderers. Perhaps they do. Astrid moved toward the hall's main entrance, where massive iron hinges hung empty, the doors long since rotted away or stolen for firewood. She always said this place held secrets. The interior was dim and musty, shafts of pale sunlight filtering through gaps in the roof to illuminate a space that had once buzzed with life. The central hearth lay cold and choked with debris, but she could imagine it blazing high while warriors gathered around long tables, their voices raised in boasts and stories. Along the walls, sleeping alcoves gaped empty, their wooden partitions mostly intact despite the years of abandonment. Whose hall was this? Erik asked, his voice echoing in the emptiness. Jarl Eriksson built it 3 generations past, Astrid replied, drawing on memories from her father's stories. He was wealthy beyond measure, they say, traded with lands as far south as Constantinople, brought back silk and spices, gold and silver. But he had no sons, and when he died his wealth vanished with him. Vanished how? No one knows. Some said he buried it before he died, fearful that his nephews would squander it. Others claimed he spent it all on one final voyage that never returned. The hall stood empty for years before his distant cousins sold it to pay debts. Erik kicked at a pile of rotting rushes, sending up a cloud of dust and decay. If there was treasure here, someone would have found it by now. Would they? Astrid moved deeper into the hall, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. People see what they expect to see, nothing more. This place has been empty so long, it's become invisible to most folk. Just another ruin on a hill. But as she spoke, her fingers traced patterns in the thick layer of dust coating one of the wall posts. Something wasn't quite right about the way the timber fit against its neighbors. The gap was too even, too deliberate. Her pulse quickened as she pressed against the wood, feeling it give slightly under her touch. What is it? Erik had noticed her sudden stillness. Probably nothing, she said, but continued exploring the anomaly with her fingertips. Your grandfather always said the old builders were cleverer than they seemed. They understood that the best hiding places were in plain sight. The post shifted again, and she realized it wasn't actually supporting the roof structure. It was decorative, designed to look load-bearing while concealing something else entirely. Her heart began to race as she worked at the hidden mechanism, remembering her grandmother's stories about halls where jarls kept their most precious possessions. Mother, hush. She'd found a small lever concealed within the carved decorations, worn smooth by hands long dead. When she pressed it, something clicked deep within the wall. The post swung aside on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow space beyond. The air that emerged carried a different scent, drier, touched with something metallic and old. Erik stepped closer, his skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. How did you know? He whispered. I didn't, Astrid admitted. But sometimes when you stop looking for something specific, you start noticing what's actually there. The hidden space was too dark to explore properly without torches, but she could see that it extended further back than the wall's apparent thickness should have allowed. Tomorrow, they would return with proper light and tools. Tonight, she would lie awake thinking about her grandmother's stories and wondering what other secrets this forgotten hall might hold. As they walked back toward the village, Erik was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. Perhaps we should delay any talk of trading voyages until we've properly explored what we've bought. Astrid smiled, hearing her husband's pragmatism tempered with her own curiosity. Perhaps we should. The setting sun painted the fjord in shades of gold and crimson, and for the first time since Ragnar's death, Astrid felt something she'd almost forgotten, the thrill of possibility. The silver coin had been well spent, she was beginning to think. Very well spent indeed. Dawn brought a grey sky, heavy with the promise of rain, but Astrid and Erik climbed the hill to the ruined hall with renewed purpose. They carried torches, rope, and Erik's woodworking tools, everything needed to properly investigate the hidden space they'd discovered. The hall seemed different in the morning light. less mysterious but somehow more substantial, as if their discovery had awakened something that had long slumbered. Erik worked methodically to widen the opening while Astrid held the torches, their flames casting dancing shadows on walls that hadn't seen such light in decades. "It goes back much further than I thought," Erik said, peering into the revealed space. The opening was large enough for a person to squeeze through, leading to what appeared to be a narrow corridor running parallel to the main hall. "The whole wall is false," Astrid realized, studying the construction. Built to look solid from the inside, but actually concealing a passage. Jarl Eriksson was more clever than anyone suspected. Erik went first, torch held high, with Astrid following close behind. The passage was barely wide enough for her shoulders, constructed with the same skilled craftsmanship as the main hall, but hidden from casual observation. After 20 feet, it opened into a small chamber carved directly into the hillside behind the hall. "By Thor's hammer," Erik breathed. The chamber was a workshop of sorts, with stone shelves carved into the walls and a small forge built into one corner. But it was what occupied the shelves that made them both stop and stare. Dozens of objects gleamed in the torchlight, intricately worked silver arm rings, golden brooches set with garnets and amber, ceremonial weapons with hilts wrapped in precious metals. And in the center of it all, on a raised stone platform, sat a single object that made Astrid's breath catch in her throat. It was a drinking horn, but unlike any she'd ever seen. The horn itself was massive, clearly from some great aurochs, but it was the metalwork that adorned it that truly took the breath away. Gold and silver had been worked into intricate patterns that seemed to flow like water in the flickering light, depicting scenes of warriors and wolves, ships and sea serpents. Also finely detailed, they seemed ready to spring to life. "This is royal work," Astrid whispered, approaching the horn with the reverence due to something sacred, the kind of craftsmanship reserved for kings and jarls of the highest standing. Erik had moved to examine other objects, his torch revealing treasure after treasure. "Mother, there's enough wealth here to buy half the village." Maybe the whole village, but Astrid was transfixed by the horn. As she lifted it carefully from its resting place, she noticed something that made her heart race even faster. Carved into the horn's tip, so small it was barely visible, was a symbol she recognized from her grandmother's stories, the mark of the legendary craftsman Wayland the Smith, whose work was said to be touched by magic itself. "Erik," she said, her voice barely steady, "I think we need to be very careful about what we've found here." "Careful? Mother, we're rich. This could change everything for us, for our family's future." A voice from the passage entrance cut him off. "Indeed it could." They spun toward the sound, torches raised, to see a figure silhouetted in the narrow opening. The man was tall and lean, dressed in traveling clothes that spoke of wealth and status. His hair was silver-streaked, his face weathered but keen-eyed, and when he smiled it didn't reach those calculating eyes. "Forgive the intrusion," the stranger said, ducking to enter the chamber. "I am Magnus Thorson, merchant and collector of antiquities. I happened to be passing through your charming village when I heard the most interesting rumors about new treasures being discovered." Astrid instinctively stepped between Magnus and the horn, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. "This is private property, stranger. You have no business here." "Ah, but I believe I do." Magnus's smile widened, and now there was something predatory in it. "You see, I've been searching for these particular items for a very long time. They were stolen from my family 3 generations ago by a certain Jarl Eriksson, who claimed them as payment for debts that were never truly owed." "That's a convenient story," Erik said, moving to flank the stranger. "Do you have any proof of these claims?" "Proof is such a flexible concept, don't you think?" Magnus replied, his hand resting casually on the pommel of a sword that looked far too fine for a simple merchant's weapon. "But I'm prepared to be generous. I'll pay you fair value for the return of my family's stolen property. More than fair, actually. Enough to ensure your comfort for many years to come." Astrid studied the man's face, reading the threat beneath his polite words. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "When a stranger offers you riches for something you found, child, Ask yourself why it's worth so much to them. And if we refuse your generous offer? She asked. Magnus's smile finally faded. I would hate for such a refusal to bring misfortune upon your family. These are dangerous times, after all. Accidents happen. Fires start mysteriously. People disappear on lonely roads. The threat hung in the air like smoke from the torches. Erik's hand went to his own weapon, but Astrid caught his eye and shook her head slightly. They were outnumbered. She could hear movement in the passage behind Magnus, suggesting he hadn't come alone. We'll need time to consider your offer, she said carefully. Of course. Wisdom comes with reflection. Magnus began backing toward the passage. I'll return tomorrow at sunset for your answer. I do hope it will be the wise one. After the strangers departed, mother and son stood in the treasure chamber, the wealth around them suddenly feeling more like a burden than a blessing. We can't trust him, Erik said. His story about stolen property is probably lies, Astrid agreed. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that he wants these treasures badly enough to threaten us for them, which means they're worth far more than we initially thought. She lifted the great horn again, studying its magnificent craftsmanship in the torchlight. Whatever its true value, whatever secrets it held, she was certain of one thing. Giving it up to Magnus Thorson would be a mistake that could haunt them forever. We need help, she said finally, and we need to understand exactly what we've found before we decide what to do with it. The weight of destiny pressed down upon them in that hidden chamber, surrounded by treasures that had been waiting decades for the right hands to claim them. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the fjord, and Astrid couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were only just beginning. That evening, Astrid sat by her hearth in the small cottage she'd called home since Ragnar's death, the great horn wrapped carefully in her finest wool cloak. Erik paced before the fire, his restless energy filling the modest room like caged lightning. We could load everything onto a boat and sail south, he said for the third time. Find a proper market in Hedeby or even further, somewhere Magnus can't follow. And then what? Astrid replied, her fingers tracing the horn's intricate metalwork through the cloth. Become wanderers? Strangers in strange lands with no family, no home to return to? Better than staying here and waiting for that wolf to return with more teeth. Astrid understood her son's desire to flee. She felt it herself. The urge to run from danger that had kept their people alive through countless generations. But something deeper held her fast, a certainty that running would solve nothing. The treasures they'd found came with a weight of history, and history had a way of following a person no matter how far they traveled. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Erik's hand went immediately to his sword hilt, but the voice that called out was familiar and welcome. Astrid. It's Thorvald. May I enter? Erik relaxed as Astrid rose to open the door. Thorvald Grimson was her father's oldest friend, a man whose wisdom had guided the village through good seasons and bad for more than 40 years. His beard was white now, his back slightly bent, but his eyes remained sharp as winter ice. Thorvald, she said, embracing the old man. What brings you out on such a dark night? Troubled thoughts and troubling news, he replied, settling into the chair Erik offered him. Magnus Thorson has been asking questions in the village. About you, about your purchase of the old hall, about what you might have found there. Astrid exchanged glances with Erik. What sort of questions? The kind that suggest he knows more about your discovery than he should, Thorvald said gravely. He's also been spreading silver around quite freely, buying information and loyalty in equal measure. Several of the younger men seem quite taken with his stories of trading opportunities in distant lands. He's building support, Erik realized. Making allies. More than that, Thorvald continued. He's been very careful to mention how dangerous it can be when villagers harbor stolen goods. How such actions can bring the wrath of powerful men down upon entire communities. The threat was clear enough. Magnus was positioning himself as the wronged party, preparing the village to see Astrid and Erik as the source of any troubles that might come. It was a clever strategy, isolating them from potential allies before making his final move. There's something else, Astrid said. making a decision that felt both necessary and dangerous. She unwrapped the horn, revealing its magnificent craftsmanship in the firelight. "We need someone we trust to help us understand what we've truly found." Thorvald's eyes widened as he took in the horn's beauty and obvious value. But it was when his gaze found the tiny maker's mark that his expression shifted to something approaching awe. "Wayland's mark," he breathed.
"Child, do you understand what you hold?"
"A drinking horn worth a fortune?" Erik suggested. More than that, Thorvald reached out with trembling fingers, not quite touching the precious object. "If this truly bears Wayland's mark, it's not just valuable, it's legendary." Wayland the Smith was said to forge objects touched by the gods themselves. Kings would sacrifice entire herds of cattle for a single piece of his work. Astrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind rattling her shutters. And Magnus Thorson knows this? If he's the collector of antiquities he claims to be, then yes, he would recognize the significance immediately. Thorvald leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "But there's something more troubling still. I've been thinking about his claims of theft, about Jarl Eriksson taking treasures that belong to his family. You think there might be truth in it?" "I think the truth is more complicated than either story suggests." Thorvald stared into the fire for a long moment. "Your grandmother told me stories, Astrid. Stories her own grandmother had passed down about the last days of Jarl Eriksson. She said he didn't hide his treasures out of greed or fear of his heirs. Then why? Because he'd made a terrible bargain and was trying to undo it before he died." Thorvald's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She said he'd traded away something precious to acquire those treasures, something that couldn't be measured in gold or silver. And in his final days, he realized the true cost of what he'd done." Erik shifted uncomfortably. "You're talking about magic, curses, old wives' tales." "Perhaps," Thorvald agreed. "But consider this. Why would a man of Jarl Eriksson's wealth hide his treasures instead of passing them to his heirs? Why would he build such elaborate concealment for objects he could have simply buried in the ground?" "Because he was trying to keep them from someone," Astrid realized. "Someone specific, someone like Magnus Thorson's family," Erik asked. "Or someone using that family's name to claim what was never rightfully theirs," Thorvald suggested. "The question you must ask yourselves is this. Are you prepared to face whatever consequences come from possessing these objects? Because I fear Magnus will not simply disappear if you refuse him." Astrid looked at the horn in her hands, its precious metalwork seeming to pulse with inner fire in the reflected flames. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "The greatest treasures always come with the greatest tests, child. The gods don't give gifts freely. They give us chances to prove what we're truly made of. Then we need to learn everything we can about these treasures before Magnus returns," she said finally. "About their true history, their value, and why he wants them so desperately. And if we discover they truly were stolen." Erik asked. "Then we'll face that truth when we find it," Astrid replied. "But we'll face it with knowledge, not in ignorance." Thorvald nodded approvingly. "Your father would be proud of such wisdom. And your grandmother would remind you that sometimes the bravest choice is not to fight or flee, but to stand firm and seek understanding." As the old man prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Be careful, Astrid. I fear this Magnus Thorson is more dangerous than he appears. And the treasures you found may carry more weight than gold or silver. They may carry the weight of destiny itself." After he left, mother and son sat in contemplative silence, the precious horn between them, like a bridge between past and future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, and perhaps new revelations about the legacy they'd inherited with a single silver coin. The next morning arrived wrapped in mist so thick that Astrid could barely see the fjord from her doorstep. It seemed fitting, she thought. The world itself was obscured, much like the truth she was trying to uncover. She and Erik made their way carefully up the hillside to the ruined hall, each carrying a satchel of tools and supplies for a more thorough exploration. "We should document everything," Astrid said as they approached the hidden entrance. "Draw pictures, make lists. If Magnus is truly determined to claim these treasures, we need proof of what we found and where we found it. Erik had brought parchment and charcoal for exactly that purpose. As they worked their way through the secret chamber, he carefully sketched each significant piece while Astrid examined them for maker's marks, inscriptions, or other clues to their origins. The collection was even more impressive than their initial excitement had allowed them to appreciate. Beyond the magnificent horn, they found arm rings that spoke of royal connections, brooches that suggested trade with distant Constantinople, and weapons that bore the hallmarks of master smiths from across the known world. But it was a small wooden box, easily overlooked among the more obviously valuable items, that provided their first real clue to the mystery. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected it from decades of dampness, was a collection of parchments covered in Jarl Eriksson's own hand. The writing was faded but legible, and as Astrid read, the true story began to emerge. "Listen to this," she said, holding one document closer to the torchlight. "It's dated just months before Eriksson's death. The bargain I made in my youth haunts my final days. What I thought was cleverness was folly. What I believed was gain was loss beyond measure. The treasures I accumulated through that devil's contract must not pass to innocent hands, for they carry with them a debt that spans generations." Erik paused in his sketching. "A devil's contract? What does that mean?" Astrid continued reading. "Magnus Bloodaxe promised me wealth beyond imagining in exchange for something I thought worthless, the loyalty and service of my bloodline for 3 generations. Only now do I understand the true nature of what I traded away. My heirs must never learn of this bargain, for they would be bound by it as surely as I am." "Magnus Bloodaxe," Erik repeated. "Could that be an ancestor of our Magnus Thorson?" Astrid finished. "It would explain much, including why he feels entitled to these treasures." She found another document, this one apparently written in greater haste. "I have hidden the treasures where only one pure of heart might find them. The blood debt cannot be collected if the objects remain concealed from those who would claim them. Perhaps in time, when the 3 generations have passed, my family's line will be free of this curse." 3 generations, Erik mused. "If this Magnus Bloodaxe made his bargain with Jarl Eriksson, then our Magnus would be the 3rd generation," Astrid realized. "The one to whom the debt comes due." They spent the rest of the morning reading through Eriksson's private records, piecing together a story that was both more complex and more troubling than they'd imagined. The Jarl hadn't been a simple victim of theft. He'd been a man who'd made a desperate bargain in his youth and spent his final years trying to break free of its consequences. But it was the final document in the collection that changed everything. Unlike the others, this one wasn't written in Eriksson's hand, but in elegant script that seemed to flow across the parchment like spilled ink. "By the ancient laws and the binding of blood, the debt shall be paid when the 3rd sun sets after the treasures are revealed," Astrid read aloud, her voice growing steadier despite the chill that ran down her spine. "No distance shall provide escape, no wall shall offer protection, no plea shall find mercy. The bargain struck in desperation shall be fulfilled in desperation, unless what?" Erik demanded when she stopped reading. "Unless one of pure heart and clear intention willingly takes upon themselves the burden of choice," she continued. "Then shall the debt be broken and the bloodline freed, but only if the choice is made in full knowledge and without coercion." They stared at each other across the treasure-filled chamber, the implications of what they'd read settling over them like a heavy cloak. "It's a riddle," Erik said finally. "Or perhaps just the ravings of a dying man's guilty conscience." "Perhaps," Astrid agreed. "But Magnus Thorson certainly believes in its power. Otherwise, why the elaborate threats? Why not simply offer to buy the treasures like any other collector?" "Because he doesn't want to buy them," Erik realized. "He wants them acknowledged as his by right, as payment of an inherited debt." Astrid carefully rewrapped the documents and placed them back in their protective box. Then we need to understand exactly what that debt entails, and whether there's any truth to this talk of curses and blood bargains. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Erik paused at the entrance. "Mother, what if we're wrong? What if we're holding on to something that truly doesn't belong to us?" "Then we'll face that truth," she replied. "But we'll do it with all the facts, not just Magnus's version of events." The mist had lifted by the time they emerged from the hall, revealing a clear view of the village below. Smoke rose from the houses in lazy spirals, and Astrid could see the familiar figures going about their daily routines. It all looked so normal, so peaceful, that it was hard to believe their small discovery could threaten such tranquility. But as they walked down the hillside, she noticed things that hadn't been there before. Strangers in the village square, men with the look of hired swords about them. Conversations that stopped when locals noticed her approach. Windows that shuttered quickly when she looked in their direction. Magnus was moving faster than she'd expected, spreading his influence through the community like poison through a wound. By the time he returned that evening for their answer, he would already have most of the village convinced that cooperation was their only safe choice. "We're running out of time," Erik observed, following her gaze. "Then we'd better use what time we have wisely," Astrid replied, clutching the documents they'd discovered. Somewhere in Jarl Eriksson's final words lay the key to understanding their situation. She was certain of it. The question was whether they could unlock that understanding before Magnus Thorson's patience ran out. The afternoon sun was already slanting toward the western peaks when Astrid made her way to the cottage of Helga the Wise, the village's keeper of old stories and ancient lore. If anyone could shed light on the mysterious documents they'd discovered, it would be the elderly woman who remembered tales from before most of the current villagers were born. Helga's dwelling sat apart from the main cluster of houses, surrounded by gardens where she grew the herbs that made her potions and remedies. At 70 winters, she moved slowly, but her mind remained as sharp as freshly honed steel. She welcomed Astrid with knowing eyes, as if she'd been expecting this visit. "You've found something that troubles you," Helga said before Astrid could speak. "Something old, something powerful, something that carries weight beyond its material value. How did you, child?" "I've lived through 7 decades of watching people make the same mistakes over and over." Helga gestured for Astrid to sit by her small fire. "And I've seen that particular look in your eyes before. In your grandmother's, when she was wrestling with knowledge that felt too large for one person to carry." Astrid carefully withdrew the documents from her satchel. "I need you to help me understand what these mean. Not just the words, but the truth behind them." Helga's expression grew grave as she read through Jarl Eriksson's final writings. When she reached the document written in the flowing script, her breath caught audibly. "Where did you find these?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hidden in the hall I bought, along with treasures that a man named Magnus Thorson claims belong to his family." Magnus Thorson. Helga set the documents aside and stared into the fire. "I remember stories about his grandfather, Magnus Bloodaxe, a man who claimed to be a merchant but dealt in things that had no business being bought or sold." "What kind of things?" "Debts, obligations, futures that hadn't yet come to pass." Helga's weathered hands gestured as if she were weaving invisible threads. "The old laws speak of such bargains, made in desperation and sealed with blood. They bind not just the individuals involved, but their bloodlines for generations to come." "You believe these documents are genuine?" "I believe Jarl Eriksson was a man haunted by choices he made in his youth," Helga replied carefully. "Whether those choices had supernatural weight or simply the weight of guilt and regret, that's harder to say. But the effect on him was real enough." Astrid leaned forward. "Magnus Thorson threatened my family. He spoke as if he had some legal right to the treasures we found. Under the old laws, he might." Helga retrieved one of the documents and pointed to specific passages. "If his grandfather truly made a binding contract with Jarl Eriksson, and if that contract was witnessed and sealed according to ancient custom, then it might still carry weight. Not in any court that operates today, but in older systems of justice. You're talking about blood courts. Trial by combat. The kind of justice our grandfathers knew. I'm talking about obligations that transcend written law, Helga corrected. The kind that pursue a bloodline until they're satisfied or broken. A chill ran down Astrid's spine that had nothing to do with the afternoon air. And how would such an obligation be broken? According to these documents, someone of pure heart and clear intention must willingly accept the burden of choice. Helga looked up from the parchment with troubled eyes. But that could mean anything from heroic self-sacrifice to simply making an informed decision about what's right. That's not very helpful. Ancient magic rarely is, Helga said with a wry smile. It tends toward the dramatic and the cryptic. But consider this. Jarl Eriksson believed he could break the cycle by hiding the treasures where only the worthy would find them. Perhaps the very act of discovering them makes you part of the solution rather than the problem. They were interrupted by hurried footsteps outside. Erik burst through the door, his face flushed with exertion and worry. "Mother, you need to come quickly," he said. "Magnus has called a gathering in the village square. He's telling everyone that we've stolen sacred artifacts that belong to his family shrine. Half the village is already convinced we're harboring cursed objects that will bring misfortune to everyone." Astrid rose slowly, feeling the weight of generations pressing down upon her shoulders. "And the other half are waiting to see what we have to say for ourselves." Helga struggled to her feet, her old bones protesting. "Then we'd better go give them something worth hearing. But first," she moved to a wooden chest in the corner of her cottage and withdrew a small object wrapped in black silk. "Your grandmother left this with me before she died. She said to give it to you when the time came for choosing." Inside the silk was a silver pendant, ancient and beautiful, bearing the same flowing script they'd seen in the mysterious document. But more than that, it radiated a sense of power that made Astrid's skin tingle. "What is it?" "Protection," Helga said simply, "and proof that your grandmother knew this day would come." She had the sight, that one did. She saw the pattern of things before they came to pass. As they walked toward the village square, Astrid could hear Magnus's voice carrying on the wind. He spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed, painting a picture of ancient wrongs and stolen heritage that made their small community sound like accomplices to generations of injustice. "We can't compete with his eloquence," Erik said grimly. "We don't need to," Astrid replied, touching the silver pendant at her throat. "We just need to speak the truth. Sometimes that's enough." But as they approached the gathered crowd, she could see doubt and fear in the faces of people she'd known all her life. Magnus had chosen his words carefully, playing on the villagers' natural caution and their desire to avoid trouble with powerful strangers. The confrontation she'd been dreading was about to begin, and everything, her family's future, her community's peace, perhaps even the fate of Jarl Eriksson's long-dead soul, hung in the balance. The village square had been transformed into an impromptu court, with Magnus Thorsson standing before the gathered community like a jarl dispensing justice. His silver-streaked hair caught the afternoon light as he gestured expansively, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to swaying minds. "And so these sacred artifacts, blessed by my family's blood and consecrated to our ancestors, have been hidden away like common thieves' plunder," he was saying, as Astrid, Erik, and Helga approached. "Is this the honor we expect from members of our community? Is this the respect we show for ancient laws and rightful claims?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Astrid recognized most of the faces, neighbors she'd known for decades, people who'd shared meals at her table and mourned with her at Ragnar's funeral. But now their expressions held doubt and worry, as if she'd become a stranger overnight. "Astrid Eriksdottir," Magnus called out, his tone shifting to one of pained disappointment. "I had hoped we could resolve this matter privately, as civilized people do. But since you've chosen to avoid me rather than face the truth of your situation, perhaps public discourse will serve us better." "I've avoided nothing," Astrid replied, stepping forward with as much dignity as she could muster. "I simply chose to learn the full truth before making any decisions." "The truth is simple enough," Magnus countered. You possess artifacts that were stolen from my family 3 generations ago. The honorable course is to return them and accept my generous compensation for your trouble, and if the truth is more complicated than your version suggests." Magnus's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Truth is what can be proven, my dear woman. I have documents that trace my family's ownership of these objects back 5 generations. Do you have anything comparable to support your claim?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Astrid was acutely aware of every eye upon her, every ear waiting for her response. She could feel Erik's tension beside her, ready to defend her regardless of the odds. "I have Jarl Eriksson's own words," she said, withdrawing the documents from her satchel. "Written in his final days, explaining why he chose to hide these treasures rather than pass them to his heirs." A new murmur ran through the crowd, this one tinged with curiosity rather than judgment. Magnus's expression darkened as he recognized the potential threat to his narrative. "The ravings of a dying man, addled by age and guilt," he said dismissively. "Hardly reliable testimony. Then let the community judge for themselves," Astrid replied. She began to read from Jarl Eriksson's confession, her voice carrying clearly across the square. The crowd listened in growing fascination as the story unfolded. The desperate bargain, the generations-long debt, the Jarl's final attempts to break a cycle of obligation. When she finished, the square was silent, except for the sound of wind through the surrounding trees. Magnus stood rigid, his carefully constructed authority visibly cracking. "Superstitious nonsense," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Ancient contracts have no bearing on modern law, but they have bearing on honor," said a voice from the crowd. Gunnar the shipwright stepped forward, his weathered face thoughtful. "If this Jarl Eriksson truly believed he'd made a devil's bargain, then his actions make sense. A man trying to protect his family from consequences he couldn't foresee." "Exactly right," Thorvald agreed, moving to stand beside Astrid. "The question isn't whether we believe in ancient magic, but whether we believe in a man's right to protect his descendants from his own mistakes." Magnus's carefully assembled supporters began to shift uncomfortably. The simple story of theft and restitution had become something far more complex, and complex stories made people nervous. "You're all missing the essential point," Magnus said, his voice rising with desperation. "Regardless of Jarl Eriksson's motivations, the artifacts legally belong to my family. I have the documents to prove it." "Then produce them," Astrid challenged. "Let us see these proofs you claim to possess." Magnus reached into his traveling pack and withdrew a leather portfolio. But as he opened it, Helga stepped forward, her old eyes sharp with recognition. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand toward the documents. Magnus hesitated, clearly reluctant, but the crowd's attention was fixed on him. Refusing would appear suspicious. He handed over the papers with obvious reluctance. Helga examined them carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each page. Finally, she looked up with a mixture of sadness and determination. "These documents are forgeries," she announced. "Clever ones, but forgeries nonetheless. The script is wrong for the period they claim to represent, and the parchment has been artificially aged." The accusation hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Magnus's face went white, then flushed red with anger. "That's a serious charge to make without proof," he said. "The proof is in the details," Helga replied calmly. "I've spent 70 years studying old documents and ancient writing. This script style wasn't used until 50 years after the dates on these papers. And this particular method of parchment preparation wasn't known in our region until trade opened with the southern kingdoms." "You're mistaken," Magnus insisted, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man whose deception had been exposed. "Am I?" Helga reached into her own pack and withdrew a genuine document from the same historical period. "Here, compare them yourself." The differences are clear to anyone with experience in such matters. As the 2 sets of documents were passed around the crowd, the truth became undeniable. Magnus's proofs were elaborate fabrications, created to support a claim that had no historical basis. This changes everything, Gunnar said grimly. If this man will forge documents to support his claims, what else has he lied about? Magnus realized his position had become untenable. His supporters melted away as the evidence of his deceptions spread through the crowd. But cornered men were often the most dangerous, and Astrid could see desperation replacing calculation in his eyes. "You think you've won," he said, his voice low and threatening. "But you understand nothing about the forces you're meddling with. Those artifacts carry a curse that will destroy anyone who possesses them unlawfully. I was trying to save you from a fate worse than death, and now—" Astrid asked. Magnus's smile was cold as winter seas. "Now you'll learn firsthand why some ancient laws should never be broken." He turned and stalked away, his remaining men following. But his parting words hung over the square like a dark cloud, casting shadows over what should have been a moment of triumph. That night, Astrid lay awake listening to the wind howl around her cottage, Magnus's final words echoing in her mind. Despite exposing his deception, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had been missed. Some crucial piece of the puzzle that would change everything they thought they understood. It was past midnight when the knock came. Soft, hesitant, barely audible above the storm. Erik was instantly alert, hand on his sword, but the voice that called out was unexpected. "Please," came a woman's voice, strained with exhaustion and fear. "I need to speak with Astrid Eriksdottir. It's about Magnus Thorsson and the treasures you found." Astrid opened the door to reveal a young woman, perhaps 25 winters, with dark hair plastered to her head by rain and eyes that held depths of desperation. She was richly dressed despite her bedraggled state, and there was something familiar about her features that Astrid couldn't quite place. "Who are you?" Erik demanded, but Astrid gestured for him to lower his weapon. "Come in from the storm," she said. "Tell us who you are and what brings you out on such a night." The woman entered gratefully, accepting the warm cloak Astrid offered. "My name is Ingrid," she said, her voice trembling with more than cold. "Ingrid Thorsson. Magnus is my father." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Erik's hand went back to his sword hilt, but Astrid studied the young woman's face with growing understanding. "You have your grandmother's eyes," she said softly. "I remember her from when I was a child. Sigrid Eriksdottir. She used to visit my grandmother." Ingrid's breath caught. "You knew my grandmother?" "She was Jarl Eriksson's youngest sister," Astrid continued, pieces of a long-hidden puzzle clicking into place. "Which makes you the Jarl's great-great-niece," Ingrid finished. "The rightful heir to everything my father is trying to steal." The silence that followed was profound. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cottage, the air seemed thick with revelations that recontextualized everything they thought they knew. "Tell us everything," Astrid said finally. Ingrid wrapped the cloak tighter around herself and began to speak. "My father has been searching for Jarl Eriksson's hidden treasures for most of my life. Not because they were stolen from our family, but because he believes they rightfully belong to him through my grandmother's bloodline. But his name, Magnus Thorsson, not Eriksson, he changed it when he married my mother, taking her family name to hide his true identity. He knew that if people realized he was connected to Jarl Eriksson, they might question his version of events." Erik leaned forward. "Why come to us now? Why betray your own father?" "Because I've seen what his obsession has done to our family," Ingrid replied, tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. "My mother died trying to stop him from pursuing this madness. My younger brother fled to Iceland rather than be part of his schemes. I'm the only one left, and I can't watch him destroy more innocent lives. What do you know about the supposed curse?" Astrid asked. "More than I wish I did." Ingrid reached into her traveling pack and withdrew a bundle of documents that looked far older and more authentic than the forgeries Magnus had presented. "These are the real family records, the true story of what happened between Jarl Eriksson and Magnus Bloodaxe." As Ingrid spread the documents on the table, a different narrative began to emerge. Magnus Bloodaxe hadn't made a supernatural bargain with Jarl Eriksson. He'd been the Jarl's business partner in a series of increasingly questionable ventures. When their activities attracted the attention of the king's justice, Eriksson had tried to withdraw from their partnership, taking with him the profits from their joint enterprises. Bloodaxe felt betrayed, Ingrid explained. He'd lost not just his investment, but his protection from royal justice. So he swore an oath of vengeance against Eriksson and all his descendants. A blood feud, Erik realized. Not a magical curse, but something just as binding in the old traditions. Exactly. And by the laws of our ancestors, that feud passes from generation to generation until it's satisfied or formally ended. Astrid studied the young woman's face, seeing truth in her eyes but also something else, a desperate hope that spoke of careful planning. "What do you want from us?" she asked. "I want to end this," Ingrid said simply. "The feud, the lies, the destructive obsession that's consumed my family for generations. But to do that, I need the cooperation of whoever rightfully possesses Jarl Eriksson's treasures. And you believe that's us?" "I believe that's you," Ingrid corrected, looking directly at Astrid. "According to these records, Jarl Eriksson had no direct heirs, but he did have provisions for the disposition of his wealth. It was to go to whoever proved worthy of it, someone who would understand its true value and use it wisely. How would such worthiness be determined? By finding it despite all attempts at concealment, understanding its history despite all efforts at obfuscation, and choosing to protect it despite all pressure to surrender it." Ingrid's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "You've done all three." Outside, the storm was beginning to abate, but inside the cottage, a different kind of tempest was brewing. The silver pendant at Astrid's throat grew warm, as if responding to the presence of Jarl Eriksson's blood descendant. "There's something else," Ingrid continued. "Something my father doesn't know. The treasures aren't just valuable, they're the key to a much larger inheritance. Jarl Eriksson didn't just hide his portable wealth. He hid the location of his greatest treasure of all, which is a ship," Ingrid said, her eyes shining with excitement. "Not just any ship, but a dragon ship built by the master craftsman of Hedeby, loaded with trade goods worth a king's ransom and hidden in a secret harbor known only to Eriksson himself." Erik's breath caught. "How do you know this?" "Because the clues to finding it are worked into the great horn you discovered. The patterns aren't just decorative, they're a map, written in symbols that only someone familiar with the Jarl's private codes could decipher." Astrid felt the world shift around her, as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become uncertain. Everything they thought they knew about their discovery had been merely the surface of a much deeper mystery. "Why tell us this?" she asked. "Why not simply claim the inheritance for yourself?" "Because I renounce it," Ingrid said with quiet determination. "My family's obsession with these treasures has brought nothing but misery. I want no part of wealth built on greed and maintained through violence. But I also can't let my father continue his destructive quest. What do you propose? Help me end the blood feud formally, according to the old laws. In exchange, I'll help you decipher the clues that will lead to the dragon ship. The treasures will remain with someone who found them honestly and values them appropriately, and my family will finally be free of this ancient madness." As dawnlight began to filter through the cottage windows, Astrid realized that their simple discovery had become something far greater than hidden treasure. It had become a chance to heal wounds that had festered for generations, to choose wisdom over greed, and to prove that sometimes the greatest wealth lay not in what could be possessed, but in what could be given freely. The question was whether they were strong enough to see it through. Dawn brought a crystalline morning that seemed to mock the turbulence of the night before. As Astrid prepared breakfast for her unexpected guest, she found herself studying Ingrid's face, searching for signs of deception or hidden agenda. But the young woman's eyes held only exhaustion and a desperate hope that spoke of someone who had finally found the courage to act against everything she'd been raised to believe, the formal ending of a blood feud. Thorvald said, when they'd summoned him to hear Ingrid's proposal, "It requires specific ceremonies according to the old laws. Both bloodlines must be represented, witnesses must be present, and the terms must be agreed upon by all parties." My father will never agree willingly, Ingrid warned. He's too consumed by his obsession to see reason. Then we'll have to force his hand, Erik said grimly. Challenge him to settle this according to ancient custom, rather than through threats and forgery. Astrid had been silent through most of the morning's discussion, turning over possibilities in her mind. The pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with warmth, as if her grandmother's spirit was trying to guide her toward the right choice. There's another way, she said finally. According to the documents Ingrid brought, the blood feud can be ended if both parties agree to submit to trial by ordeal, a test that determines who has the gods' favor in their claim. What kind of ordeal? Ingrid asked. The recovery of Jarl Eriksson's dragon ship, Astrid replied. If Magnus truly believes he has a rightful claim to the treasures, let him prove it by successfully interpreting the clues and finding the greatest treasure of all. If he fails, his claim is forfeit forever. Erik stared at his mother. That's incredibly dangerous. If he succeeds, then perhaps his claim has merit after all, Astrid said. But I don't think he will succeed. Greed makes a poor guide for such delicate work. Thorvald nodded approvingly. It's a clever solution. By the old laws, trial by ordeal supersedes all other claims. If Magnus accepts the challenge, he's bound by its outcome. And if he refuses, then he admits his claim has no merit, and the feud dies with him. They spent the morning working out the details of their proposal. The challenge would be issued publicly, with the entire village as witnesses. Magnus would have 3 days to study the horn and decipher its clues, then lead an expedition to recover the dragon ship. If he succeeded, all of Jarl Eriksson's treasures would be acknowledged as his. If he failed, he would renounce all claims and formally end the blood feud that had poisoned both families for generations. He'll accept, Ingrid said with certainty. His pride won't let him refuse a public challenge, especially one that offers him everything he's ever wanted. But as they prepared to issue the challenge, Erik pulled his mother aside for a private conversation. Are you certain about this? He asked. We could simply disappear, take the treasures and sail for distant lands where Magnus could never find us. We could, Astrid agreed, but would that truly solve anything? He'd pursue us eventually, or turn his attention to other innocent people who might stumble across clues to Jarl Eriksson's wealth. Sometimes running from a problem only makes it someone else's burden. And if we're wrong, if he actually manages to find this dragon ship, Astrid touched the pendant at her throat, feeling its steady warmth, then we'll have learned something important about the nature of worthiness and divine favor. But I don't think we're wrong, son. I think this Magnus Thorson has spent so much time focusing on what he wants to take that he's forgotten how to truly see what's offered. The challenge was issued that afternoon in the village square, with the same crowd that had witnessed Magnus's humiliation the day before. Word had spread quickly about Ingrid's arrival and the revelations she'd brought, and the community gathered with the tense anticipation of people about to witness something unprecedented. Magnus arrived with a smaller retinue than before. Several of his hired men had apparently decided their coin wasn't worth the complications that were multiplying around their employer. But he stood tall and defiant as Astrid read out the terms of the trial by ordeal. You would gamble everything on an ancient superstition, he asked when she finished. I would settle this matter according to laws that both our bloodlines respect, Astrid replied. Unless you're afraid that your claim won't bear scrutiny by the gods themselves. The challenge struck home. Magnus's face flushed with anger and wounded pride, and Astrid knew he'd already decided to accept before he spoke the words. Very well, he said. I accept your trial by ordeal. 3 days to study your precious horn, then I'll show you what true worthiness looks like. The crowd murmured approval. This was drama worthy of the old sagas, a conflict that would be remembered and retold for generations. But as the gathering dispersed, Astrid noticed troubling signs. Several of Magnus's men were moving through the crowd, speaking quietly with villagers, and the conversations had the look of recruitment rather than casual discourse. He's hiring local guides, Erik observed. Men who know these waters and hidden places along the coast. Expected, Thorvald said, but also dangerous. If he finds willing accomplices among our own people, it complicates our position considerably. That evening, as Astrid sat with the great horn before her fire, studying its intricate patterns by candlelight, she felt the weight of generations pressing down upon her shoulders. The metalwork was even more complex than she'd initially realized, layers of meaning woven together in ways that spoke of profound artistry and deep knowledge. The outer ring depicts the seasons, she said, tracing the patterns with her finger, while Ingrid watched intently. Spring planting, summer sailing, autumn harvest, winter's rest. But underneath, the tides, Ingrid finished, and the phases of the moon. My grandfather taught me to read such symbols when I was a child, before my father's obsession consumed our family. Then you understand what this means? The ship is hidden in a place that can only be reached at specific times, when the tide and moon and season align in exactly the right configuration. Erik leaned closer, studying the horn's intricate details. When is the next such alignment? Ingrid calculated carefully, consulting the patterns and comparing them to their current situation. 5 days from now, she said finally. The autumn tide will reach its peak just as the moon enters its dark phase, creating the conditions needed to reach the hidden harbor. Then Magnus will have to move quickly if he successfully deciphers the clues, Astrid realized. The window of opportunity is narrow, which works in our favor, Erik said. Rushed decisions lead to mistakes, and Magnus has already proven himself prone to overconfidence. But as they continued studying the horn, Astrid became aware of sounds outside her cottage. Footsteps in the darkness, whispered conversations, the subtle signs of people moving with purpose through the night. Magnus wasn't simply preparing for the challenge, he was preparing for war. He doesn't intend to play by the rules, she said quietly. Did we expect him to? Ingrid asked. My father has never let honor stand in the way of getting what he wants. Then we'd better be ready for treachery, Erik said grimly. Because something tells me the next few days are going to test more than our ability to read ancient clues. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again over the fjord, and the wind carried a chill that spoke of winter's approach. Soon, one way or another, the long conflict between their families would reach its conclusion. The question was whether wisdom and patience would triumph over greed and violence, or whether the cycle of blood and betrayal would claim yet another generation. Astrid clutched the horn tighter, feeling its ancient power pulse beneath her fingers. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. The third day dawned grey and ominous, with heavy clouds pressing down upon the fjord like a woolen blanket. Magnus had spent the previous 2 days studying the horn under the watchful eyes of village witnesses, his frustration growing more apparent with each passing hour. The intricate patterns that had seemed so clear to Astrid and Ingrid apparently yielded their secrets less readily to his impatient scrutiny. He's struggling, Erik observed as they watched from across the square. Magnus was hunched over the horn, surrounded by rough-looking men who clearly had more experience with swords than with ancient symbols. Good, Astrid replied, but her satisfaction was tempered by concern. Desperate men made dangerous choices, and Magnus had the look of someone whose carefully laid plans were beginning to unravel. As the sun reached its zenith, Magnus finally straightened from his study of the horn, his face flushed with a mixture of triumph and relief. I have it, he announced to the gathered crowd. The location is clear to those who understand the old ways of navigation. Then state your interpretation publicly, Thorvald demanded. Let the community witness your understanding before you depart. Magnus hesitated, clearly reluctant to reveal his conclusions where others might benefit from his work. But the challenge required transparency, and he had no choice but to comply. The ship lies in the hidden harbor of Raven's Rest, he said finally. 3 leagues north along the coast, accessible only during the dark tide when the sea reveals passages normally hidden beneath the waves. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several of the older fishermen nodded recognition of the location, though their expressions suggested skepticism about its significance. Raven's Rest is a death trap at low tide, called out Gunnar the shipwright. Rocky shallows and hidden reefs that have claimed more than one vessel over the years, which is precisely why it would make a perfect hiding place, Magnus countered. Fear keeps the unworthy away, while knowledge guides the deserving to their reward. Astrid studied Magnus's face as he spoke, noting the uncertainty beneath his confident words. He'd identified a location, certainly, but whether it was the correct one remained to be seen. The horn's patterns were complex enough to support multiple interpretations, and she suspected Magnus had chosen the most obvious reading, rather than the most accurate one. "When do you depart?" she asked. "At sunset," Magnus replied. "The tide turns 2 hours after dark, creating the conditions needed to reach the hidden harbor safely. Then we'll be ready to witness your success," Astrid said. "Or your failure." Magnus's eyes narrowed at the implied challenge, but he simply nodded curtly and turned away to make his final preparations. As the crowd began to disperse, Ingrid approached Astrid with worry etched across her young face. "I've been thinking about his interpretation," she said quietly. "Raven's Rest does fit some of the symbols on the horn, but not all of them. He's missing something crucial. What do you think he's overlooked?" "The timing," Ingrid replied. "He's focusing on the dark tide, but the horn also references the sleeping sun, the time when day and night stand in balance. That only happens twice each year, at the spring and autumn equinoxes." Astrid felt a chill of realization. "The autumn equinox was last week." "Exactly. Which means the true window of opportunity has already passed. Whatever Magnus finds at Raven's Rest tonight, it won't be Jarl Eriksson's dragon ship." As evening approached, the entire village gathered at the harbor to witness Magnus's departure. His small fleet consisted of 3 boats, his own vessel, heavily armed and crewed by his hired men, in plus 2 fishing boats manned by local guides who'd been persuaded to join his expedition. "This feels wrong," Erik murmured as they watched the preparations. "Too many armed men for a simple treasure hunt." "He's preparing for confrontation," Astrid agreed. "Either with whatever guardians he expects to find at the hidden harbor, or with us when he returns empty-handed." Magnus stood at the prow of his lead vessel, the great horn clasped in his hands like a talisman. In the fading light, he cut an impressive figure, every inch the successful merchant adventurer about to claim his rightful inheritance. But Astrid could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted nervously between the horn and the darkening horizon. "Citizens of Kjarvik," he called out as his boats prepared to depart. "Tonight, you will witness the recovery of treasures that have been hidden for 3 generations. When I return, you'll understand the true magnitude of what has been at stake in this dispute." The boats pushed off from the dock and disappeared into the gathering darkness, their lanterns growing smaller until they were indistinguishable from stars reflected on the water. Behind them, they left a village full of people who would spend the night wondering whether they'd just witnessed the beginning of a legend or the final act of a madman's obsession. "Now we wait," Astrid said simply, but even as she spoke the words, she knew their own trial was far from over. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Astrid found herself pacing the shore, watching for signs of returning boats, while Erik and Ingrid maintained their vigil beside her. The rest of the village had gradually dispersed to their homes, but a hardy few remained, unwilling to miss the conclusion of events that had captivated their entire community. It was near midnight when they heard the first sounds, not the triumphant songs they might have expected from successful treasure hunters, but shouting voices carried on the wind, filled with anger and frustration. "Something's gone wrong," Erik said. Straining to see through the darkness, the boats appeared shortly after, their lanterns bobbing erratically as they struggled against wind and tide to reach the harbor. Even from a distance, it was clear that Magnus's expedition had not gone according to plan. One of the fishing boats was listing badly, taking on water from some unseen damage. While angry voices erupted from all 3 vessels, Magnus was the first to reach the dock, leaping ashore with the horns still clutched in his hands, but his face twisted with fury. Behind him came his men, looking like soldiers returning from a defeat rather than treasure hunters flush with success. Nothing, Magnus roared as the remaining villagers gathered around the dock. Empty caves and broken rocks. Your precious horn led us to a death trap that nearly claimed 2 of my boats. Perhaps the fault lies not with the horn, but with the interpretation, Astrid replied calmly. Though her heart was racing with relief and vindication, Magnus whirled to face her, his eyes wild with rage and exhaustion. You knew there was nothing there and let me waste my time and risk my men's lives on a fool's errand. I knew that greed makes a poor compass, Astrid said, and that the treasures of the worthy are not easily claimed by the unworthy. Enough of your riddles. Magnus advanced on her, his hand moving to his sword hilt. By the terms of your challenge, I had 3 days to decipher the horn's secrets. I've done so and found nothing. That proves the horn itself is worthless, a clever fake designed to mislead the gullible. Or it proves that you lack the wisdom to understand what you're looking at, Ingrid said, stepping forward to face her father. The horn told you exactly where to look, but not when. You ignored half the clues because they didn't fit your expectations. Magnus's face went ashen as he recognized his daughter's voice. Ingrid, what are you doing here? Ending this madness, she replied firmly. Father, you failed the trial by ordeal. By the ancient laws you invoked, your claim to Jarl Eriksson's treasures is forfeit. I haven't failed anything. Magnus snarled. The trial was corrupted from the beginning. These people deliberately misled me, gave me false information. They gave you exactly what you demanded. Thorvald interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of law and tradition. Access to the horn, time to study it, and witnesses to verify your interpretation. That you chose to see only what you wanted to see is not their fault. Magnus looked around the gathered crowd, searching for support and finding only suspicious faces and hostile stares. His men were backing away, clearly unwilling to continue following a leader whose judgment had led them into dangerous waters for no reward. This isn't over, he said, but the threat lacked the conviction of his earlier pronouncements. There are other courts, other laws, none that will overturn a trial by ordeal witnessed by an entire community, Thorvald said firmly. You've had your chance, Magnus Thorson. Accept defeat with what dignity you can muster. For a moment, Astrid thought Magnus might actually draw his sword and try to take by force what he couldn't claim by right. The tensions stretched taut as bowstring, with everyone poised for violence. But then something seemed to break inside the man, the certainty that had driven him for so many years, finally cracking under the weight of repeated failure. Keep your cursed treasures, he said, his voice hollow with defeat. They brought nothing but misery to everyone who sought them. Perhaps you'll learn that lesson as I have. He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at his daughter. And you, Ingrid, will you stay here with these strangers, or come home where you belong? My home is wherever I choose to make it, Ingrid replied. And I choose to make it somewhere free from the poisonous obsessions that have consumed our family. Magnus nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. Without another word, he walked away into the darkness, his remaining men trailing behind him like the remnants of a broken army. As the sound of their departure faded, the villagers began to disperse, finally convinced that the drama was truly over. But Astrid remained on the dock with Erik and Ingrid, staring out at the dark waters that had witnessed both triumph and defeat. Is it really finished? Erik asked. The feud is ended, Ingrid confirmed. By his failure and my formal renunciation of all claims, the blood debt between our families is finally paid. And the dragon ship? Astrid asked. Does it truly exist? Ingrid smiled for the first time since her arrival. Oh, it exists, but not where my father was looking, and not when he was looking for it. The real treasure waits for those patient enough to understand that some gifts can only be received when the time is right. As they walked back toward the village, Astrid felt the silver pendant at her throat grow warm one final time, as if her grandmother's spirit was expressing approval of the night's outcome. The greatest treasure, she realized, hadn't been gold or silver at all. It had been the chance to choose wisdom over greed, healing over hatred and patience, over the destructive urgency that had driven Magnus to his downfall. Spring came early that year, bringing with it the kind of gentle warmth that made the previous autumn's storms seem like distant memories. Astrid stood in the doorway of the restored longhouse, watching Erik and Ingrid work together in the garden. They'd planted where the treasure chamber once lay hidden. The secret room had been filled in and sealed after they'd carefully relocated its contents to a more secure location, but not before documenting every piece for future generations. The village had prospered over the winter months. Word of their discovery had attracted traders and scholars from across the known world, all eager to study the genuine artifacts of Jarl Eriksson's legendary wealth. But more importantly, it had attracted craftsmen and artisans who recognized the quality of their work and wanted to learn from such masters. "The new workshop is nearly finished," Erik called out, gesturing toward the structure rising beside the hall. "Gunnar thinks we'll be able to start taking commissions by midsummer." "Good," Astrid replied, pleased to see her son's excitement about their expanding enterprise. The decision to use their newfound wealth to establish a center for traditional craftsmanship had proven wise. Rather than simply hoarding treasure, they were creating something that would benefit their entire community for generations to come. Ingrid had proven invaluable in this effort. Her education and family connections had opened doors that would have remained closed to a simple village widow, while her genuine passion for preserving ancient knowledge had won over even the most skeptical scholars. She'd also brought a practical wisdom that balanced Erik's enthusiasm with careful planning. "There's news from the harbor," Thorvald announced as he approached the hall. At his advanced age, the old man moved more slowly than before, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. A ship from Iceland, flying Gunnar Eriksson's banner. Astrid felt her pulse quicken. They'd been expecting this visit, but that didn't make it any less significant. Gunnar was Magnus's younger brother, the one Ingrid had mentioned who'd fled to Iceland, rather than participate in his father's obsessive quest. His arrival would provide the final piece needed to complete their remarkable year. The ship that entered their harbor was beautiful, a sleek trading vessel that spoke of prosperity and skill. Its crew moved with the confident precision of experienced sailors, and their captain was clearly a man accustomed to command. When he stepped onto the dock, Astrid could see the family resemblance to both Magnus and Ingrid. But where Magnus had carried himself with desperate hunger, Gunnar radiated the contentment of someone who'd found his proper place in the world. "Sister," he said simply as Ingrid ran to embrace him, "your letters painted an extraordinary picture. I had to see for myself." "And what do you see?" she asked. Gunnar looked around the thriving harbor, noting the new construction, the increased activity, the signs of a community that was growing rather than merely surviving. "I see what our family could have been if we'd chosen building over taking." The reunion dinner that evening was held in the restored longhouse, with the great horn serving as the centerpiece of a feast that celebrated both old traditions and new possibilities. Gunnar shared stories of his life in Iceland, of the trading networks he'd established, and the family he'd built far from the shadows of ancestral obsessions. "Magnus came to see me last winter," he said during a quiet moment in the conversation. "He was a broken man, consumed by regret and anger at what his choices had cost him, but also, I think, finally beginning to understand the difference between wanting something and deserving it." "How did you leave things with him?" Astrid asked. "He's returned to our family's original lands in the north, trying to rebuild what he destroyed through years of neglect. Whether he'll succeed," Gunnar shrugged, "that's between him and whatever gods still listen to the prayers of prideful men." As the evening progressed, the conversation turned naturally to the future. Gunnar had brought proposals for trading partnerships that would benefit both communities, while his crew had spent the day examining the quality of work being produced in the village's expanding workshops. "There's something else," Ingrid said, as the formal dinner concluded and they gathered around the central hearth. "Something I've been waiting for the right moment to share." She produced a familiar object, the horn that had started everything, but looking somehow different in the firelight. As Astrid examined it more closely, she realized why. New patterns had been worked into the existing design, so skillfully integrated that they seemed to have always been there. "When did you—" Erik began. "Over the winter months, working in secret with the master craftsmen who've been studying the original techniques," Ingrid replied. "I wanted to add our own chapter to the horn story, the tale of how ancient wrongs were finally made right. The new patterns told their story in the symbolic language of their ancestors. The discovery of hidden treasures, the confrontation between greed and wisdom, the breaking of ancient feuds and the forging of new alliances. But more than that, they pointed toward the future, toward the real treasure that Jarl Eriksson had hidden. "The dragon ship," Astrid said, understanding flooding through her. "You've found it." "We've found it," Ingrid corrected. The location was always clear to those who knew how to read the complete message. Jarl Eriksson didn't just hide his wealth. He created a test that would ensure it would only be found by those wise enough to understand its true value. "And where has it been waiting all these years?" Gunnar smiled. "Beneath our own harbor, in the deep channel that's been here since before the village was founded. Protected by depth and current from casual discovery, but accessible to those who knew exactly where to look and exactly when the conditions would be right. The spring equinox," Erik realized. Tomorrow," Ingrid confirmed. "When day and night stand in perfect balance and the tide reaches its lowest point in 7 years. The perfect time for worthy hands to finally claim Jarl Eriksson's greatest treasure." As they prepared for the next day's expedition, Astrid reflected on the strange turns that had brought them to this moment. A single silver coin, spent in what had seemed like desperation, had opened a doorway to wonders beyond imagining. But the greatest treasure hadn't been gold or silver, ancient artifacts or legendary ships. It had been the discovery that sometimes the most valuable things in life were the ones that brought people together rather than driving them apart. Outside, the spring stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, and somewhere in the depths of the harbor, Jarl Eriksson's final gift waited patiently for hands that would use it wisely. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that wisdom and patience could triumph over greed and haste. But tonight, it was enough to sit by the fire with family, both old and new, and know that some stories, at least, could have truly happy endings.